My girlfriend Lisa had a daughter, Mia, who had just turned 8, and I had been dating Lisa for 6 months, often spending weekends with them both. They lived in a really nice home in Los Altos, nestled in one of those upscale neighborhoods where the houses sat on spacious lots bordered by oak trees and quiet streets. Lisa had asked if I could watch Mia for 3 days while she attended a marketing conference in Portland. We'd been planning this for a few weeks, and after our usual morning coffee together, we went over emergency procedures and Mia's routine one last time before she headed out to catch her flight. I hung out with Mia for a few hours, helping her with her science project and listening to her talk about school. Then we took a break, and I prepared our dinner. We got back to working on her project around 8 and agreed to finish one last planet before Mia's bedtime. I was helping her paint Jupiter when I heard a car door slam outside, followed by footsteps approaching the front door and then knocking. I walked over and unlocked the door, leaving the latch secured as I opened it slightly. There was Mark, Mia's father, standing on the porch. He looked coldly at me when I opened the door. I knew a little about Mark from Lisa. He was her ex-husband who had lost all custody rights years ago and wasn't supposed to have any contact with Mia. Mark asked about Mia's whereabouts, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. He peered through the gap in the door, insisting he had every right to see his daughter, and that he should be the one looking after her when Lisa was away, not some boyfriend. Then he turned and started walking away. Obviously, I found this very threatening. I closed the door and locked it, then went to the back door and checked to make sure that it was locked as well. Mia asked me if that was her dad, and I just assured her that everything was fine. Then I went back to helping her with the project. We worked on Jupiter's rings for a while longer, though it was hard to focus. I told Mia it was time for bed and then escorted her to her bedroom and waited outside as she got ready. Once she was in bed, I came back to the living room and decided to do some work on my laptop, sitting on the recliner. I had a report that needed to be finished before a meeting the following day. I started to hear a crunching sound coming from somewhere. I stopped my work and listened more carefully. It was coming from the front of the house. I went over to the front door and turned on the porch light. Looking around, I couldn't see anything other than an empty porch. I stayed there listening for a few more minutes before eventually returning to my work. I wondered if my mind was just playing tricks on me, as I was already on edge after the earlier encounter with Mark. Trying to focus on my work again, I must have dozed off in the recliner because sometime later I woke up to my laptop's low battery warning beeping. The blue glow from the screen was the only light in the room. I closed the computer and sat up, rubbing my eyes tiredly. That's when I noticed how completely silent the house had become. Then I began to hear that same crunching sound, but this time clearly footsteps. They were coming from the right side of the house, right by the room where I sat. A few seconds later, they stopped, seemingly right outside one of the windows with its curtains drawn. Truly frightened, I walked over to the window slowly and quietly and pulled back the curtain. Nothing was there. I looked around but saw no movement in the darkness. I told myself it was nothing. Got a glass of water and headed to the master bedroom. The next morning, I woke up to my phone alarm. Coming out of my deep sleep, the sleeping pills I take for anxiety always knock me out completely. I found Mia at the front door, frantically trying to unlock it. When I asked what she was doing, she told me she'd been awake for hours, hearing someone walking around outside, softly calling her name through each window. Chills ran down my spine as I realized I'd slept through everything. Thank God the deadbolt was too high for her to reach. I didn't want to think about what could have happened if she'd managed to open that door and go out to her father's voice in the dark. I told her to stay inside while I checked around the house. I grabbed the largest kitchen knife I could find and went out the front door, locking it behind me. Walking around the house, I found fresh scratches around several window frames and deep scuff marks in the paint beneath them, as if someone had been trying to force them open. Near the living room window where I'd heard the noises, there were muddy handprints on the glass. The yard's thick grass made it impossible to spot any footprints, but someone had definitely been here. As I made my way back to the front door, I spotted Mark's car parked 2 houses down. He was just sitting there watching the house, making no attempt to hide his presence. He must have been there for hours. A moment later, I saw him step out of the car and start walking toward the house. My chest tightened with panic as I realized he wasn't planning on leaving, just biding time. I went back inside and hurried Mia into Lisa's bedroom, locking the door behind us. I kept the kitchen knife tucked behind my back, not wanting to frighten Mia more than she already was. We hadn't been in there long when we heard glass breaking in the living room. Mark's voice carried through the house, alternating between calling softly for Mia and shouting about his rights to see her as her father. I kept Mia behind me in Lisa's bedroom while calling the police. Through the door, we could hear him moving through the house, throwing things and ranting about me trying to steal his family. I positioned myself between the door and Mia, knowing the police would take at least 10 minutes to arrive. Within minutes, Mark was at Lisa's bedroom door, pounding frantically and trying to break it down. The whole door frame shook with each impact. I braced myself against the dresser I'd pushed in front of the door, feeling it move with each blow as he rammed his shoulder against it. Then police sirens sounded from the street, and we heard him flee through the same broken front window. Officers caught him trying to leave the street. We stayed with Lisa's sister until Lisa returned home. The police investigation revealed Mark had been planning this for weeks. His apartment contained detailed notes about Lisa's conference schedule, surveillance photos of me with Mia, and supplies for taking her across state lines. He'd been tracking their routines, watching me become closer to them both, and growing increasingly obsessed with reclaiming his family. Mark hadn't just wanted visitation rights. He'd convinced himself that by removing me from the picture, he could force his way back into their lives permanently. The careful planning and the surveillance photos, all of it, it showed how long he'd been waiting to destroy our new life together. I worked as a babysitter during my junior year of high school. Not by choice, but because my parents insisted that I work and earn money to buy the PlayStation that I wanted. Our town's fancy beachside neighborhood was full of working parents who needed sitters, and somehow my straight-A grades convinced them I was responsible enough for the job. Unlike the Martins' house, our house was about as far away from the beach you could possibly get in the town. For the most part, I took care of the Martins' 6-year-old boy a couple times a week when they had work events. The kid was quiet, which made him easy to watch. He didn't do much besides watch TV and play with his Lego sets, and seemed okay with having me around despite being stuck with a teenage boy instead of the usual female sitters. This was my 6th time watching him. However, this time, instead of work events, the parents were heading out for their anniversary dinner and staying overnight at some fancy hotel in the city. The modern beachfront house usually felt peaceful, and it felt like I was on a small holiday myself. But that night a nasty storm was rolling in off the water, making the place feel isolated against the darkening sky. The weather forecast had warned about heavy rain and strong winds, but the Martins understandably didn't want to cancel their plans. They'd been looking forward to this night for months. In their rush to leave, Mr. Martin mentioned something about the garage door sticking, but I wasn't really paying attention. The first few hours went as usual. I watched cartoons with him and made him a small frozen pizza, trying to ignore the increasingly heavy rain pelting against the windows. The wind had picked up considerably, making the palm trees in the backyard bend and sway. After finishing his food, he went to use the bathroom. When he came back, his usual calm demeanor had changed. He told me about strange shuffling noises coming from the garage. I was confused and immediately muted the TV. Sure enough, with the room silent except for the storm outside, I could clearly hear something moving around in there. The sound was faint beneath the rain hammering against the windows and the wind whistling through the eaves, but there was definitely something. Seeing the boy was scared, I assured him it was probably just some beach equipment getting knocked around by the storm. I told him to wait in the living room while I checked it out. From the kitchen, I could hear the noises more clearly. Definitely movement, not just the wind. Approaching the door that connected the house to the garage, I noticed the door was locked, which was some relief. When I pressed my ear against it, I could clearly hear movement on the other side, and what sounded like someone coughing. Walking to the front window, I could see the garage door wide open. That's when I remembered Mr. Martin mentioning it could stick. It seemed like it hadn't closed properly when they hurried out to their reservation. I returned to the living room, not wanting to actually open the connecting door, or go outside in the storm to investigate any further. The boy was waiting anxiously on the couch and jumped up when he saw me. I told him everything was fine and gave him a quick hug to calm him down. After a few minutes watching his favorite show, we'd almost forgotten about the whole thing. The storm continued to intensify outside. A couple hours later, it was getting close to 9 o'clock, and I started getting him ready for bed. We went upstairs to his room, and I made sure he was settled. His room faced the street rather than the ocean, which seemed to help block some of the storm noise. I checked that his nightlight was working since the power had been flickering, then headed back downstairs. I sat on the couch for probably 30 minutes just watching TV before hearing the shuffling from the garage again. This time much louder and more distinct. Looking back now, I should have called the police the first time I heard someone coughing in there, but I was 17 and naive. I'd convinced myself it must be something else. The storm playing tricks on my ears. Or maybe I was just paranoid being alone in someone else's house. I didn't want to look stupid calling 911 over nothing. But this time the noises were unmistakable, and they sounded like someone moving things around. When the boy called out, complaining about the noises from upstairs, that was it. I couldn't pretend it was nothing anymore. The storm had picked up even more. Wind howling around the house and making the windows rattle. Standing in the kitchen, I could see shadows moving under the door leading to the garage, cast by what must have been a flashlight or something similar inside. My hand shook as I grabbed the kitchen phone, ready to call for help. While I dialed 911, I called up to the boy to stay exactly where he was. After calling the police, I called the Martins at their hotel. The storm made the phone line crackle, but they got the message and said they'd come right home. When the police arrived, they entered through the wide-open garage door. There they found a young woman huddled in the corner, surrounded by newspapers spread out like a makeshift bed. A small backpack sat beside her, and she was wearing a rain-soaked jacket. One officer recognized her from missing person reports. She was a runaway they'd been searching for the past week. She had been seeking shelter from the storm. The Martins arrived just as the police were finishing up. They thanked me repeatedly for calling them and spoke with the officers about the situation. The woman was led to a patrol car, wrapped in a blanket, looking scared but somehow relieved. She was young, probably not much older than me. About an hour later, I was able to head home as they secured the house and filed reports. The storm had finally begun to die down. I never babysat for the Martins, or anyone else, again. It took longer, but I eventually saved up enough for that PlayStation by mowing lawns all summer. As a 19-year-old college freshman studying early childhood education, I often babysat for families in the area. It fit perfectly around my class schedule, and I genuinely enjoyed working with kids. Most of my regular clients lived in suburban neighborhoods, but occasionally I'd accept jobs further out when families were in a bind. That's how I found myself agreeing to watch Mrs. Reynolds' 6-year-old son, Tommy, while she covered an emergency night shift at the hospital, something completely outside her normal schedule as a senior anesthesiologist, typically working daytime surgeries. They lived in a beautiful home in Washington, surrounded by towering evergreens with the nearest neighbors barely visible through the trees. The house featured floor-to-ceiling windows without heavy curtains, creating an unsettling fishbowl effect after dark. I imagined they'd flood the rooms with natural light during the day, but at night, they left everything exposed. A sliding glass door led to a fenced backyard, and multiple skylights dotted the vaulted ceilings. While I typically enjoyed peaceful settings, something about the isolation made me slightly uneasy once the sun set. Mrs. Reynolds had called in a panic that morning, explaining that she had to cover an unexpected night shift. Her regular sitter was unavailable, and she'd heard about my experience through mutual friends. I arrived at her house in the early evening, and we spent time going over Tommy's routine and emergency contacts. She apologized repeatedly for the last-minute request, before finally heading out to start her shift at the hospital. I spent several hours with Tommy, listening to him talk about school and his friends, while we played board games at the dining table. The wall of windows behind us gradually darkened as evening settled in. We took a break to make dinner together in the spacious kitchen. After eating, we agreed to watch some cartoons before bedtime. I was scrolling through streaming options, trying to find something age-appropriate, when Tommy's voice caught my attention as he pointed toward the front door. Someone was knocking. I had no idea if Mrs. Reynolds was expecting any visitors, but she hadn't mentioned anything to me, and having someone show up after dark in such an isolated location made me increasingly nervous. With growing unease, I approached and opened the door just slightly. A disheveled man in his late 30s stood on the porch, wearing a wrinkled button-down shirt and sporting several days' worth of stubble. He appeared startled when he saw me, instead of who he clearly expected. His eyes looked past me into the warmly lit interior, scanning the visible portions of the living room. After asking about Mrs. Reynolds, he lingered for an uncomfortable moment before turning away, his shoulders tense with barely contained agitation. The encounter left me deeply unsettled. I secured both the front and back doors, checking each lock twice, then verified all ground floor windows were properly latched. I assured Tommy it was just someone looking for directions, though my own hands trembled slightly as I returned to the couch. We started the movie, but my mind kept wandering back to the strange man. The film ran longer than expected, and by the time it ended, we'd passed Tommy's bedtime by almost an hour. I followed him upstairs as he got ready, helping him locate his favorite pajamas and supervising his bedtime routine. After tucking him in beneath his space-themed comforter, I made my way back downstairs. The wall clock showed it was after 10. Still too alert to sleep, I decided to watch some TV to wind down. As the show played, I began hearing crunching sounds from outside, like footsteps on fallen leaves and twigs. Muting the television, I listened more carefully, my heart rate accelerating. The noise seemed to be moving around the perimeter of the house, methodically circling from the front porch toward the back. I switched on the exterior lights and peered out through various windows, but could only see empty decking against the impenetrable darkness of the tree line. I stood listening for several minutes before returning to the couch, trying to convince myself it was just typical forest sounds amplified by darkness and isolation. While I usually loved this kind of setting during daylight hours, nighttime transformed the peaceful woods into something more ominous. Turning the volume back up, I stretched out on the couch to get more comfortable, positioning myself to keep the windows in view. The position proved too relaxing, and despite my lingering anxiety, I drifted off shortly after. A couple of hours later, I awoke to find the TV still on. Switching it off, I sat up and rubbed my eyes, momentarily disoriented. The house's complete silence felt oppressive until it was broken by distinct footsteps crunching through leaves. The footsteps stopped directly outside one of the curtained windows, followed by the subtle scraping of metal against metal. Fighting down panic, I crept toward the window and carefully pulled back the fabric. Though I saw nothing immediately, movement near the sliding glass door caught my eye. It was the same man from earlier, now trying to work something into the door frame. The exterior light illuminated his face, twisted with obsessive determination as he worked at the lock. Heart pounding, I raced upstairs to Tommy's room. I gently woke him and hurried him into the master bathroom, locking us inside as the man's voice carried up from below. He called out for Mrs. Reynolds with increasing desperation, insisting they were meant to be together, demanding she stop hiding from him, his words becoming more unhinged with each passing moment. The sound of breaking glass shattered the night. He had smashed part of the sliding door so that he could reach inside to unlock it. I called the police in a whisper, staying on the line as his footsteps moved through the house below. His voice became more frantic with each empty room he discovered, items crashing to the floor as he searched more aggressively. When his heavy steps started up the stairs, I knew we couldn't wait for help. Tommy was small enough that I could carry him. Working quickly and quietly, I climbed through the bathroom window first, then reached back to pull Tommy through into my arms. Tommy was a real trooper. The sturdy trellis attached to the house gave me enough support to carefully climb down while holding him close to my chest. My years of gymnastics training, steadying each movement. The moment our feet touched ground, I grabbed his hand and we ran through the wooded yard toward the nearest neighbor's house. Police arrived within minutes of us reaching safety. They caught the man still searching the house, calling out for Mrs. Reynolds. Later investigations revealed he had been stalking her for months, without her knowing. He had misinterpreted her professional kindness at the hospital where she worked as romantic interest, choosing this night to force a confrontation, unaware of her emergency shift change. Mrs. Reynolds rushed home immediately after being notified, horrified by what had transpired, but grateful for our safe escape. Police evidence showed he had been meticulously planning this night, tracking her movements, and learning her routines. His journal revealed his twisted fantasy of making Mrs. Reynolds his wife, and Tommy his son.